In episode 42, titled SSH versus RDP, Secure Management Assumptions the Exam Tests, the goal is to build a reliable way to choose a remote management protocol safely without leaning on folklore or personal preference. Secure remote administration is rarely about which protocol is better, and more often about which assumptions you are making about identity, exposure, and the type of access you are granting. On the exam, those assumptions show up in questions that sound simple, but quietly test whether you recognize how administrative pathways become attack pathways. Remote management is also where convenience pressure is highest, because administrators want speed and reach, and attackers want the same things for different reasons. If you anchor your thinking in risk, access scope, and control points, you can answer protocol questions consistently, even when details shift. Before we continue, a quick note: this audio course is a companion to the CloudNetX books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Secure Shell, which is a protocol designed for encrypted remote access, is typically associated with command line control and is widely used for administration across many operating systems. It shines when the task is discrete, repeatable, and well-suited to text-based interaction, such as starting services, checking logs, modifying configuration files, or running maintenance commands. It also fits naturally with automation, because scripted workflows can invoke secure shell sessions to execute commands remotely in a controlled and auditable way. That combination of command access and automation scripts is a major reason Secure Shell is so common in modern infrastructure management, including hybrid environments. From a security perspective, the primary concern is not that Secure Shell is inherently unsafe, but that it can be deployed with weak authentication, broad exposure, or excessive privileges that turn a useful tool into a liability. When you evaluate Secure Shell, you should think about what it enables, how it authenticates, and how tightly its reach is constrained. Remote Desktop Protocol, which is a protocol that provides a graphical remote session, is often used for administration when a full desktop experience is necessary. Graphical administration is still common in many enterprise environments, especially where legacy tools, vendor consoles, or administrative interfaces require a graphical user interface to function properly. Remote Desktop Protocol can also be the path of least resistance for teams that rely on older management workflows, where clicking through dialogues is more familiar than composing commands. That familiarity can be both a strength and a weakness, because it reduces friction for legitimate administrators while potentially increasing the scope of access granted in each session. A graphical session often implies broad interactive capability, which can include file transfers, clipboard redirection, and other features that expand the effective attack surface if controls are weak. For exam purposes, remember that Remote Desktop Protocol tends to provide richer access than is strictly necessary for many tasks, and the security question often revolves around whether that richness is justified. The biggest shared risk for both protocols shows up when their listening ports face untrusted networks. Exposure risk rises sharply when management services are reachable from the public internet or from large, loosely controlled network zones, because attackers can probe, brute force, and exploit at scale. Even strong encryption does not make an exposed service low risk, because encryption protects confidentiality and integrity of the session, not the existence of the service or the weaknesses around authentication and configuration. An exposed port also creates a predictable target, and predictable targets get constant attention from automated scanning and exploitation campaigns. In hybrid designs, it is easy to accidentally expose management ports through misconfigured security groups, firewall rules, or routing changes that were made for troubleshooting and never rolled back. The exam often tests whether you recognize that remote management traffic should be treated as highly sensitive and therefore should rarely be directly reachable from untrusted networks. A common safe assumption is that you should use an intermediate control layer, such as a bastion host or a virtual private network, before allowing secure shell or remote desktop protocol sessions. Bastion host is a hardened jump point that concentrates administrative access into a monitored and controlled pathway, reducing the number of exposed entry doors. Virtual private network, which is an encrypted tunnel that extends a trusted network to a remote user, can also reduce exposure by ensuring management ports are reachable only from within the protected tunnel. The key idea is that remote management should be reachable only after identity is strongly verified and the connection originates from an approved, controlled path. This reduces the chance that unknown systems, unknown locations, and unknown actors can even attempt to authenticate to your management plane. On the exam, answers that place secure shell or remote desktop protocol directly on the internet without compensating controls are usually wrong unless the question explicitly includes strong restrictions and monitoring that make the exposure exceptional and justified. In practice, the safest designs assume management comes from the inside, not from the open world. For secure shell specifically, authentication choices are a frequent test point, and key-based approaches are usually favored over password-based approaches. Key-based secure shell uses asymmetric cryptography, where a private key proves identity without transmitting a reusable secret like a password over the network. This reduces reliance on human-chosen passwords, which are often weak, reused, or susceptible to phishing, and it also supports stronger operational controls such as key rotation and centralized management. Certificate options extend this model by introducing a structured trust mechanism where keys can be signed and validated within a defined authority, enabling time bounds, revocation, and identity attributes. The security payoff is that access becomes harder to brute force and easier to manage at scale, especially when administrators change roles or leave an organization. For exam logic, key-based secure shell and certificate-based trust generally map to better identity assurance, provided they are paired with least privilege and proper key handling. The nuance is that keys are powerful, so storing them carelessly or failing to protect private keys can erase the benefit. Remote desktop protocol protections often focus on preventing unauthorized sessions and reducing exposure to credential attacks. Network-level authentication, which requires a user to authenticate before a full remote desktop session is established, is a key safeguard because it reduces resource consumption and blocks some classes of unauthenticated interaction. Strong multi-factor authentication is also a major control because remote desktop protocol environments are frequent targets for credential theft, phishing, and brute force attacks. The point is not that one control is sufficient, but that remote desktop protocol should be treated as high-impact access and therefore should require high-confident identity checks. Depending on the environment, protections may also include restricting which users can initiate remote sessions, limiting where remote desktop protocol can be reached from, and disabling unnecessary session features that increase data movement risk. On the exam, answers that add network-level authentication and strong multi-factor authentication signal that you understand remote desktop protocol's risk profile and the need to harden it. If the question includes legacy tools, it may be nudging you toward remote desktop protocol, but it still expects you to secure it aggressively. There are many scenarios where command line interface access, meaning text-based administrative control, beats full desktop access from a security standpoint. If the task is to restart a service, update a configuration setting, check resource consumption, or review logs, a secure shell session can provide exactly the needed capability without granting the broad interactive surface of a full desktop. Limiting scope matters because attackers thrive on unnecessary capability, and a full desktop session can enable actions far beyond the minimum required for a given maintenance tasks. Command line interface access is also easier to constrain through role-based privileges because specific commands and directories can be controlled, logged, and audited more consistently than arbitrary graphical interactions. In hybrid environments where systems may be ephemeral, scaled dynamically, or managed through automation pipelines, command line interface patterns fit naturally with repeatability and standardization. From an exam perspective, the safest choice often leans towards secure shell when the requirement is routine system management that can be performed with narrow, auditable commands. The test is whether you recognize least privilege in the context of remote administration, not whether you personally prefer a terminal. At the same time, there are scenarios where a graphical user interface is genuinely required, and forcing command line interface access would be impractical or would introduce other risks. For example, some driver installation workflows, device management consoles, or complex policy changes may rely on graphical tools that are not available through a command interface. In many enterprise environments, certain administrative tasks are still performed through graphical management consoles, and the organization may have established change control processes around those tools. When a scenario explicitly calls for graphical administration or references legacy tools, remote desktop protocol becomes a realistic fit, but only when secured properly through restricted reachability and strong authentication. The security decision then becomes about reducing the session's blast radius through segmentation, limiting who can access it, and ensuring strong visibility into session activity. In hybrid architectures, graphical administration sometimes appears in the on-premises side of the house more than the cloud side, but the exam will treat the principle the same regardless of location. The lesson is that remote desktop protocol is not inherently wrong, but it should be justified by necessity and wrapped in controls that reflect its power. A classic pitfall that the exam loves is leaving default ports and weak passwords in place. Default ports are easy to scan for, and weak passwords are easy to guess, and together they create a high-probability compromise path that attackers can exploit at scale. Even when passwords are not weak, password-only authentication is often a weaker posture than key-based or certificate-backed identity, especially when the service is reachable from broad networks. The pitfall is not only technical but cultural, because teams sometimes treat management access as temporary during setup and then forget to harden it when the environment becomes production. In hybrid deployments, it is also common to have inconsistent security posture across segments, where one side is hardened and the other side is left with defaults due to different teams or tooling. Exam questions may phrase this pitfall as quick access, temporary access, or for troubleshooting, and you should read those as warnings. If you see default ports paired with weak passwords in an answer option, treat it as a red flag unless the question is explicitly asking you to identify what is wrong. Another pitfall is skipping session timeouts and idle locks, which can turn an authenticated session into an easy win for an attacker who finds an unattended terminal. Session management is part of security even when authentication is strong, because authentication is a point-in-time event while sessions persist across time. Idle locks, re-authentication requirements, and maximum session durations reduce the chance that an administrative session remains open longer than necessary. This matters for both secure shell and remote desktop protocol, but it tends to be more visible in remote desktop protocol environments because graphical sessions often remain open while administrators multitask. On systems with high privileges, an unattended or stale session is equivalent to leaving the keys in the ignition, and the longer it persists, the more likely it is to be abused. The exam tests this in subtle ways, sometimes by describing a shared admin workstation or a remote access gateway where sessions are frequently left open. When you see a scenario involving privileged sessions, assume timeouts and idle controls are part of the expected secure posture. Monitoring is the safety net that helps you detect when assumptions fail, which they eventually will. You should monitor for unusual logins, such as access from unexpected locations, times, or devices, and for patterns that suggest brute force attempts or credential stuffing. You should also watch for lateral movement, meaning attempts to move from one system to another within the environment after gaining an initial foothold, because remote management protocols are often used as stepping stones. For secure shell, this might appear as new key usage patterns, unusual command sequences, or connections to targets that an administrator does not typically manage. For remote desktop protocol, it might appear as unusual session frequency, access to sensitive hosts outside normal responsibilities, or repeated authentication failures followed by success. Monitoring should be paired with strong logging, centralized collection, and alerting that is tuned to administrative activity, not just general user activity. On the exam, options that include monitoring unusual logins and lateral movement often indicate a mature view of remote administration because they acknowledge that prevention is necessary but not sufficient. To reinforce the decision-making, imagine being asked to pick secure shell or remote desktop protocol for a particular management need, and then justify the controls that make that choice safe. Secure shell tends to fit when the goal is narrow command execution, automation, and least privilege access, especially when you can use key-based authentication and certificate-backed trust models. Remote desktop protocol tends to fit when a graphical interface is required for legacy tooling or specific administrative tasks that cannot be done reliably through command line interface methods. In both cases, safe selection assumes you do not expose management ports to untrusted networks, and instead require a controlled access path, such as a bastion host or a virtual private network. It also assumes strong authentication, such as multi-factor authentication, reasonable session timeouts, and monitoring that can detect suspicious access patterns. The exam does not want you to memorize that one protocol is always right, but it does want you to demonstrate that your choice includes a defensible security posture. The protocol is the vehicle, and the controls are the brakes, steering, and seatbelt. To close episode 42, titled SSH versus RDP, Secure Management Assumptions the Exam Tests, keep your selection cues simple and consistent. Choose the least powerful access method that still meets the administrative need, and then protect it with layered controls that assume exposure is dangerous. Secure shell is typically the better fit for command-driven management and automation, especially when key-based and certificate-backed trust reduces reliance on passwords. Remote desktop protocol is often necessary for graphical administration and legacy tools, but it must be hardened with network-level authentication, strong multi-factor authentication, restricted reachability, and careful session management. The most common failures are predictable, including default ports, weak passwords, and sessions that never time out, and the exam expects you to recognize those as avoidable risks. Monitoring for unusual logins and lateral movement is what turns your design from hopeful to resilient, because it gives you early warning when something is off. Your rehearsal assignment is to draft a short policy statement that defines when secure shell is allowed, when remote desktop protocol is allowed, and which controls are mandatory for each, because policy clarity is what makes secure management repeatable under pressure. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.